So now we'll be looking at Chapter 3, Sanders Senior. And this chapter is in the form of diary entries. You remember at the end of last chapter, we've just heard the revelation that Whitechapel's son, who's been killed with the 200 lashes and the whipping, was not actually Whitechapel's son, but the son of the overseer's father. And that means that the overseer has actually killed his half-brother. So the overseer's father is Sanders Senior, and the overseer is Sanders Junior. So the action here is now like the backstory. We're going back in time and finding out how this conception, the birth of Chapel, the half-brother to Sanders Jr., actually happened. So it's set around 13, 14 years before the events of Whitechapel's chapter. So it goes back in time 13 to 14 years. And this chapter, again, short diary entries that give a sense of the voice of Sanders Senior. So the first thing we realize is Sanders' wife has passed away. My wife, God bless her soul. And he hasn't yet told his son how his mother died. So his son asks how his mother died, and he's deciding he'll tell his son later. Now, this son he's talking about is Sanders Jr., the son of Sanders Senior with his first wife. Okay. He talks about how lonely he is. For 5 years, he hasn't had a wife. Then at the top here, there is this feeling that his son reminds him of his wife. And here is the first part, the second half of page 37, where I've noted this is about the cruelty that Sanders Senior treats his slaves. And Sanders Senior represents the common view in the South at the time towards slaves and the idea of slavery. It was accepted during the time, and in fact, cruelty to slaves was the norm. It was normal at the time. And if you turn on to page 38, the cruelty to slaves is again highlighted here in the March 8th diary entry. So Mr. Whitechapel said that the slaves looked thin, but Mr. Sanders Senior thinks that giving extra food to the slaves is a bad idea. Okay, so Mr. Whitechapel has increased the rations for the slaves to give them more food. And here, Whitechapel, you are wrong, sir. Cattle need fattening, not slaves. So the idea is that cattle or livestock are even in a higher position than slaves. Cattle can be treated even better than slaves can. Again, Mr. Sanders Senior is representing a view that was held at the time. And further down on this page, March 25th, here, down the bottom, this quote, they're buying a new slave. It says 2 of the older women slaves have died, and he thinks it's because they overfed them, and they will have to be replaced by 1 new girl. Market day is next Tuesday. Excuse the interruption. I've now put my phone on silent so we won't be interrupted. The point of this part is that it really emphasizes that slaves are seen as a commodity. It emphasizes market day and the practice of buying and selling slaves. Okay, and the next thing that I thought was worth pointing out, there's a new slave. That slave is Cook, who becomes Whitechapel's wife. She's kind and they like her. April 12. There is another emphasis here of the inhumanity of the view of slavery at the time. So we are different from slaves in intelligence and human standing before God. But then interestingly, my son then asked why Whitechapel could do a knot that I couldn't do. So the child, that childlike innocence, doesn't just accept the view, but questions and notices that actually Whitechapel is just as capable. Anyway, so the girl, the new cook, insists she's 15. That's the age. Turn over the page. I've noticed on page 40 here, halfway down at May 4, this is the first sign of his lust. He's feeling lustful while looking at the new slave girl, who is Cook, the Whitechapel's second wife. Okay, and here, June 4, talks about Whitechapel's friendship with Cook. And if you're taking notes on the cruelty of the view towards slaves, and particularly Mr. Sanders' cruelty, inhumanity, brutality, you may want to look here. I had occasion to beat a slave for indolence. This word occasion kind of has the idea of luck. So I was lucky enough to be able to beat a slave. And I think that's a horrible, terrible expression. Mr. Whitechapel, though, told him off and said, "You're never allowed to use your feet or your fists, only the whip." Okay. Whitechapel asks if he can marry Cook. Oh, and also she must be 22 up here. Over onto the next page. Okay. There's the friendship or relationship we see a little bit between Whitechapel and Sanders Jr. And Sanders Jr. seems to admire him in some of the things we see. So he was hopping just the way that Whitechapel taught him. The top of page 43, you'll notice that he's noticing Cook. So his lustful thoughts towards Cook are seen in this diary entry. His plotting towards Cook can be seen at the bottom on October 19th. I invited Cook into my bedroom on a false pretext that there were dishes in there. A false pretext here means an untrue reason. It wasn't the real reason. Okay, over onto the next page. Actually, I think we'll go to 45. So if you're taking notes, come to 45, which is December 24th, Christmas Eve. And this is the rape scene where he actually writes in his diary about the rape. Some graphic expressions that are used. He waited for her to pass by the door, grabbed her arm, covered her mouth, dragged her to my bed. So not only is it a rape scene, but it seems premeditated or planned because he was waiting for her. Okay. And then on January 1st, Whitechapel and Cook got married. And January 9th, okay, Cook, there is another rape. Okay. And the brutality of this, the heartlessness of this is emphasized here. He describes it as relieving himself, like it was just a physical need that he was relieving. And also the violence of it, he was choking her until she almost fainted. Okay, so it's incredibly abusive, which is something that you can also note in your table. But here is also where you can see the powerlessness of women, especially slave women. So Cook wants to be returned to the fields. He's at the top of January 6th, the top of page 46. She wants to return, but he says no, Mr. Sanders Sr. So he has the power to control where she works as well. All right, and here we go, 47. He's found out, okay? So at the bottom of here, January 10th, they all have the truth of the rape has become known, and Mr. Whitechapel is fining him. Again, is this justice? Just a fine for the rape of a woman? He apologizes, and Mr. Whitechapel says he's getting a male cook for him. Then February 10th, she's pregnant. Her period didn't come. I hope Whitechapel's fecundity prevails over mine, or fecundity, that's fertility. So he's hoping it's Whitechapel's son, but it obviously turns out that it is Mr. Sanders' son. Okay. He reveals the truth of the mother dying in childbirth. This is a dream. More sarcasm. Next page, 50. Okay, there is a brutal description of whipping a runaway to death. It's like the history repeating itself. Here we go, May 27th. So the runaway is back. He got 200 lashes, just like his son. And here, the slave who was whipped caught a fever and died. Okay. And then, here was August 1st is the truth about the dying in childbirth of the first wife. And now September 1st, we have the birth of Chapel. And we know he resembles my son in all but colour. So the child is dark, but he looks like Mr. Sanders. Over on page 53. So here we see the consequence for Mr. Sanders Sr. of raping Cook and the birth of this illegitimate child because of the rumours. Mr. Whitechapel decides that he had better get married. Now that's Mr. Sanders Sr. better get married again. And he says that he's a married man again, so he gets married again. But my son has not taken to her. And there's a sense that the woman who is mentioned earlier on, if you want to read that, is not blessed with many of God's attributes given to a woman. Probably means she's not pretty, but maybe also that she can't cook or other things that we expect a woman to do. So that's the end of the diary entries of Mr. Sanders Sr. Hope you've got some good notes there, everyone.